Okay, I'm going to take you back 241 years to 1783 in Paris, France, and the first untethered manned hot air balloon flight took place. This was a big deal. It was the first time man was taken to the sky untethered. Most people think of the Wright brothers as the first time humans took to the skies, but actually it happened over 100 years earlier. And there were lots of people in the crowd to witness this event. And one of those people was Benjamin Franklin, the American polymath, inventor, and diplomat. And there's a famous story. After this event, Franklin was asked a question about this innovation. And that question was, what use is it? Like, what's the point? And his response is quite famous, and it went something along the lines of, what use is a newborn baby, right? And this was kind of quite a profound response in terms of the way we interpret new technologies. The point he was making was that we don't look at a newborn baby and judge it based on the things it can't do, right? We understand that babies grow and evolve and learn, and so do technologies. And you just wouldn't point at a baby and say it can't walk, it can't talk, and so it has no hope, and it's a write-off, right? That would be irrational. But we do this people do this with new technologies a lot, and with hot air balloons, they evolved just like babies grow and evolve. And I call this the Franklin Fallacy. It needs a name, and I'm calling it the Franklin Fallacy, and it's something you notice will rear its head whenever a new technology comes along, right? And this is a really useful framework. I mean, most people at this conference aren't going to be falling for this fallacy, but it's a good framework to explain to people why they should put their doubts to one side and maybe not be so cynical. And I'm going to run you through the history of this fallacy. You saw it happen when the aeroplane emerged, bicycles, light bulbs. Shortly after the Wright brothers did their first public demonstration, the Manchester Guardian, now just the Guardian, you'll be familiar, said shortly after, "We are not belittling the exploit of Mr. Wright. It is a great triumph of mechanical ingenuity, a magnificent feat of acrobatics, but we cannot understand to what practical use a flying machine that is heavier than air is to be put. The English government, like the French and the German, shows its wisdom in neglecting aeroplanes and concentrating its attention on the improvement of the airship." So ironically, just as the hot air balloon suffered from the Franklin Fallacy, so did manned flight. And what people said was, well, you've just made a worse airship. It can't take off and land vertically. It can't carry many people. It has to constantly keep moving in the air. There were lots of reasons why you would think that airships were the future. Headlines like this appeared using that same logic. Aeroplanes only a fad. And airships were socially accepted, more developed. It was easy to make a convincing argument that aeroplanes were only a fad, because it was hard to kind of predict how it would grow and evolve. You couldn't really predict jet engines and stuff like that. The bicycle suffered from a similar thing. Early bicycles were called bone shakers because they didn't have inflatable tires, which acted as suspension. So early bicycles were quite uncomfortable to ride, and depending on the surface. So again, you take an innovation, you see its early flaws, and you can you can quickly dismiss it. But it's a mistake because it's hard to predict how things will improve over time. Light bulbs, early light bulbs didn't last very long. They were a cool science experiment, but they didn't last long enough to be practical or make sense. But Edison looked at that and thought, what if there was another way? And he and his team tested over 1,000 different materials until they came upon bamboo, which he used to create a long-lasting light bulb, and suddenly this thing had legs. But if Edison had just looked at like the limitations, the early limitations, it would have been easy to dismiss the light bulbs. And my favorite example is home PCs. So in the 1970s, early 1980s, lots of hype around personal computers. Everyone's going to have one. There was a lot of hype and people painting a picture of the future that's now become true, but then it was all speculative. And there were limitations. These things were expensive. They had, limited use cases. And again, the Franklin Fallacy came along. These quotes are my favorite. The home computer may be going the way of video games, which are a dying fad. For most personal tasks, such as balancing a checkbook, consulting airline schedules, writing a modest number of letters, paper works just as well as a computer and costs less. Very, very amusing in retrospect. Even more amusing when you realize it was actually Steve Wozniak who said these quotes. So this was 1985. The Macintosh had been released a year earlier. It wasn't selling as well as people expected. And Woz did an interview where he basically said, they're just too expensive and not useful enough in the home. And he basically said that they've been oversold and this isn't really going to pan out. And interestingly, the same year, Steve Jobs basically echoed what Steve Wozniak was saying. He admitted in an interview with Playboy that the home PC was more of a conceptual market than a real market. But the difference between Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs is Steve Jobs wasn't suffering from the Franklin Fallacy. He saw the short-term limitations, but he was a long-term optimist. And he did this interview with Playboy, which was super fascinating, and it really summed up the challenge of countering the Franklin Fallacy. And he said, the hard part we're up against now is that people ask you about specifics and you can't tell them. 100 years ago, if somebody asked Alexander Graham Bell, what are you going to be able to do with a telephone, he wouldn't have been able to tell them. And the interviewer kind of said, well, are you just asking people to have blind faith in this vision of the future? You just want people to put down thousands of dollars and just hope everything pans out? And Jobs replied with this. He said, I can only begin to speculate. We see that a lot in our industry. You don't know exactly what's going to result, but you know it's something very big and very good. And this kind of sums up the problem with arguing against the Franklin Fallacy. You can't be that specific. The limitations people are bringing up, that's a fact, that's reality. And then you're asking people to kind of have a faith. But history shows that when there's a lot of smart people working in a new technology, you can be damn sure that a lot is going to change, a lot is going to improve, and you shouldn't judge a new technology based on these early limitations in the same way that you shouldn't judge what a baby is going to become in the future. And this is all very relevant to this conference because we've seen this happen with cryptocurrency. Bitcoin energy usage was a big thing. The World Economic Forum projected it was going to consume more power than the world does in 2017. Bitcoin itself has a bunch of limitations. And then stuff like Ethereum came along, which removed them. And Ethereum itself, its energy use was really quite high for a long time. When NFT art collecting blew up, there was a lot of criticism around the amount of energy and carbon emissions. A lot of people protesting selling art in that way as a result. And of course, we saw the shift to proof of stake, which reduced the energy use by 99%. And as we saw at the beginning of this conference, the opening speeches, the improvements to Ethereum over the last few years have been incredible. And to judge Ethereum 2 years ago based on its limitations would have been a big mistake. Now, of course, everyone here knows this. That's why you're in this space. If you were suffering from this fallacy, you wouldn't be here. But the reason I'm doing this talk is because I think it's a really useful framework to explain to people how to think about new technologies and why their reservations and doubts might not be so rational, and they should think beyond the current reality. Yeah, I'm a little bit under time here, but that's it. I run a project called Pessimists Archive. We explore the history of technophobia and moral panic. We have a Twitter account. We have a newsletter. You can scan the QR code for that now. But we catalog a lot of examples of the Franklin Fallacy and other things. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Louis. So, I really like the animations that was used in the slides.
Yes, AI.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
All right, so we have 2 questions here. I urge everybody to continuously send your questions over, but let's talk about the first one. So, in your opinion, what point is the technology ready to be judged without the fear of the tech being too early?
Wait. At what point is the technology ready to be judged? I mean, what is a technology? I don't really know, in your opinion.
We could take the second one first. Maybe you can have some time to think about it.
Well, no, I think if a limitation persists for many, many years, and it's starting to look like that's kind of hard to solve, then okay, that's fair enough. But in the early days, it's like, let's just hold out, right? Let's not assume this is going to persist. But obviously, there are some things which you can't overcome. But it's best not to act in too much haste around that. So.
Understood. Okay. And the second one would then be, what are some of the times where the Franklin Fallacy turned out to be right? So it's a counter-argument to that.
I mean...
Maybe metaverse?
Yeah, I mean, I guess telegraphy had its limits, and then the telephone came along, so, I think it was fair to doubt that, it's funny that in the Playboy interview, Steve Jobs talks about this. He talks about people predicting the telegraph, there'd be a telegraph on every desk. But he said that, learning to use Morse code was just not practical for most people, and the telephone came along, and it made it more accessible to people. So, I guess that's one, telegraphy kind of hit a wall there.
Okay.
And, I guess you could say, Ethereum was created because Bitcoin had some hard limitations.
Yeah.
But I guess the broader technology is blockchain technology, and that's what people were judging based on the limitations of Bitcoin. Yeah, there are hard limits, yeah. But you shouldn't be too hasty in deciding what those hard limits are, I think.
Well, fantastic insight from Louis. Thank you very much. For anyone who there's one more question actually that just came in. Oh. Has it worked for you to convince people of blockchain potential by explaining the Franklin Fallacy?
I mean, I'm not sure, but I hope it does. I hope it helps I kind of concocted this concept about a month ago, so I haven't had all that much time to deploy it. But it's really worth using history to point this stuff out and point to headlines about people dismissing the aeroplane, dismissing the light bulbs, because these are all things we accept wholly and we understand their value. So I'm hoping I will be able to use it. So
Could probably be a fun story at Christmas.
absolutely.
All right, thank you very much.